Algerians have voted in a referendum. They're deciding whether to approve changes to the constitution. It follows months of anti-government protests and anger. So, does Algeria need a new constitution? And how will it affect the balance of power? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Last year, Algeria's protest movement toppled longtime leader Abdelaziz Bouteflika. But protesters are still demanding change because they say many of the old political elite are still in charge. New President Abdelmadjid Tebboune has promised to address their complaints. On Sunday, his government held a nationwide referendum to approve changes to the constitution. They include the introduction of presidential term limits, giving more powers to parliament, and allowing the military to be deployed abroad. But many Algerians say the changes don't go far enough. We'll bring in our guests in a moment. First, this report from Mohammed.
For nearly 2 years, millions of Algerians have been demanding change. They say they want a more balanced system of power sharing, a stronger popular representation, and guarantees of social and individual rights. President Abdelmadjid Tebboune promised to address those demands through amendments to the constitution. If approved, they'll limit presidents to serve only 2 terms in office and give the president the ability to appoint a prime minister from his own party if it wins a majority. And crucially, it will give parliament the power to remove the prime minister through a motion of no confidence. The government says the amendments respond to people's fundamental aspirations by establishing a genuine democracy. And there are more changes planned on social and individual freedoms.
We don't recognise this system in power, and this constitution, if passed, will plunge us into the abyss, just as the predecessors of those in power plunged us into the abyss. We do not recognise them.
The reform is designed to turn the page on a history of centralised powers and military intervention in Algerian politics.
I swear that whatever they do, we will not stop until we achieve independence. And I swear that we will continue to fight until this regime falls.
The protest movement, otherwise known as Al-Hirak, forced the resignation of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika in April last year after months of mass rallies. But government critics say his loyalists, both civilian and military, still run the country. Even after the presidential election that was organized in December in an attempt to bring change. All 5 presidential candidates in that election were part of the former government. The election saw the lowest turnout in Algeria's history. The date November 1st is symbolic for Algerians. It's the 66th anniversary of the beginning of the War of Independence from colonial France. But the mood of national solidarity that Algeria witnessed on that day 45 years ago is largely absent today because of political division. Mohammed, Jazeera.
Algeria has a long history of unrest that goes back more than 30 years. In 1988, riots forced constitutional changes that led to the first multi-party system. In 1992, a military coup preventing the Islamic Salvation Front from winning elections sparked a civil war. 7 years later, Abdelaziz Bouteflika became president and played a role in bringing an end to the war. But his bid to stand for a 5th term last year sparked mass protests and led to his resignation. Abdelmadjid Tebboune took over in a controversial election, promising to launch a new Algeria. Protesters say the government hasn't done enough to meet their demands. All right, let's bring in our guests in Casablanca. Yasmine Hasnaoui, a North African affairs specialist. In Beirut, Dalia, Ghanem, a resident scholar at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center. And in Paris, Amel Boubaker, research fellow at the School for the Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences. Welcome to each of you. Yasmine, let me start with you. Does this new constitution meet the demands of protesters who have been calling for political change?
Well, actually, Mohammed, as the Algerians are set to vote today in a constitutional referendum which coincides with the anniversary of, it's very important, with the start of Algeria's War of Independence from France from 1954 to 1964. Algeria's leaders, they see today's constitution as an important part of the strategy to move beyond Algeria's popular unrest. However, many Algerians, as I've heard it, as you know, I heard it in the documentary, that many Algerians, notably those who participated in the Hirak streets, seem skeptical about many things. First, they seem skeptical about the articles of the Constitution, the applicability of the Constitution. Adding to that, the Algerian opposition, and we've seen that during the campaign of the referendum in last month, that they rejected the Constitution, and they opposed to go to the polls. And besides that, because they see that the Constitution is a way to distract attention from the old ruling elite's continued grip on power. Mm-hmm. So I think it's also important to note that today's referendum comes at a time when Abdelmadjid Tebboune is hospitalized in overseas in Germany. And many observers see that the new constitution represents a centerpiece of Abdelmadjid Tebboune's strategy to neutralize or actually to contain the Hirak movement when it staged, vast demonstration last year. While others see this, it's very important. While others see, they see that the assurances that Abdelmadjid Tebboune conveyed with the people of his cabinet, that the constitutional proposals were formulated on the foundation of a modern state, a new Algeria, as he mentioned several times, while serving the citizens through Algeria. I think he has been enabled to convince, it's very important, is that he has been enabled to convince the opposition, the lawyers, and also those the Algerian citizens that are still frustrated about this current new constitution.
All right. Dalia, let me ask you, what are the main points and proposals that are at play in this constitutional referendum?
Yes, sure. But before that, I want to say something. The change of the constitution or the amendment of the constitution were never actually one of the demands of the Hirak. The Hirak never asks for that. This is why this is a non-event. So as a matter of fact, the constitutional revision was adopted already on Friday, September 11 by the Council of Ministers and by the National Popular Assembly, the lower house of parliament and the Senate. So what does it contain? The document contains 73 recommendations divided into 6 main areas, including strengthening the power of the separation of powers, the president prerogative, the head of the government and parliament and the judiciary, and the fight against corruption. But mainly, the president will not actually supposedly exercise more than 2 consecutive or separate mandates, and the prime minister will be directly accountable to parliament. But behind this choice, it is very important to keep in mind that actually nothing really changed. The regime is maintaining, if I may say, the concentration of power at the palace of Al-Muradia in the hands of the president who they choose. And who chose this? We are talking here about the military. So the military in Algeria remain the real locus of power, and they do what they have always done, meaning place a man at the presidential palace with a hyperpower and control him. This is the political domination of the military. This is the political domination of the military over civilians. And in a nutshell, civil-military relationships in Algeria didn't really change since the independence of the country in 1962.
Amal, opposition leaders and activists have denounced this referendum as a ploy simply for the regime to hold on to power, to buy more time. What do you say?
Well, we have to understand that there's a huge crisis now in Algeria. If we talk about the constitution will be passed today and it will be adopted, and And Algeria, we have a constitution that is, as Dalia mentioned, giving all power to, or that is built on presidential powers and presidential powers over the parliament, over justice, but also in real partnership, and that's the first time that it is mentioned as such in the constitution, with the army. Now, with the absence of Tebboune, Algeria is getting back to its old crisis, political crisis of what kind of balance between the military and the presidential facade Algeria can have. And it's not just a crisis that has followed the impeachment or the resignation of Bouteflika as such. Since Bouteflika, actually, the regime really has not really been able to decide what kind of project, what kind of vision, what kind of balance between the civil and the military state he wanted. But now, with the absence of Tebboune, we are even getting back to a crisis that has started in 1992, since the army has cancelled the elections that have been won by, at that time, the Islamic Salvation Front, an Islamist party. The crisis that it had hurt really of Algeria today is what kind of political life without real political participation can the regime maintain with the absence of Tebboune? What kind of revolutionary legitimacy can he still, or constitutional legitimacy can the regime still play with without a recast of, or without recasting institutions, without having new institutions, without launching a new transition? So really, what is occurring currently in Algeria is an old crisis that is once again put ahead with the absence of Tebboune, and there's no way the Algeria can get out this crisis, even with a new president, if Tebboune don't come back soon.
Yasmine, you heard Dalia and Amal both speak a little bit about the role of the military in Algeria in their answers. I want to ask you to expand a little bit on that, because one of the proposed changes in the Constitution, in the referendum now, relates to the army. It would allow them for the first time to be deployed outside of national territory on international peacekeeping missions. Are there concerns about what the implications of this would be for the military and for society?
Well, actually, yes, because I think that that amendment is first of all is vague, and it was put actually because of the threats. You know, you see like about the terrorism threats in the Sahel, what happens in Libya, in Mali, etc. But it puts a little bit doubt about the the regional assets, like how Algeria is going to deploy its army, and what benefits it can be given to Algeria in order to deploy this army. So I think it's a bit vague, and that's what happens in the Constitution is that many articles are vague and they have to be redefined. Notably, the deployment of the army. There should be like a kind of law that structures the deployment of the army. We know what's happening in the region. You know what's happening with the conflict that is happening in Libya, in Mali, etc., and a little bit of issues between that is happening between Morocco and Algeria, knowing that Algeria is hosting the Polisario in its territory. So one has to re-question that the deployment, and it's among the reasons why the people in the Iraq are a bit confused about all these articles, and it's also the fact that many who still want to take up the streets despite the pandemic, because to demand a better balanced power in the hope to steer the country away from authoritarianism. So people in the Iraq, they see that the army does still have a power, even if now Abdelmadjid Tebboune is hospitalized in overseas. But we see that the the acting of the armed forces, General Said Jinqriha, who has not been neutral in his position regarding the constitution, while encouraging the Algerian to go to the polls. So I think that gives a little bit questions to everything, and especially to that deployment of the army overseas. That has to be redefined and re-questioned by the international community.
Dalia, since being elected, has President Tebboune actually reached out to the Hirak protest movement? Has there been any kind of dialogue?
Well, unfortunately, the answer is no. And by putting in place this referendum, I believe that he is aggravating something that has started on February 22nd, 2019. There is the legitimacy crisis. There is a profound crisis of trust and legitimacy in Algeria. Let us, as your report said it, first, one should remember that the election of Abdelmadjid Tebboune took place despite its rejection by a majority of Algerians. And the abstention rate was officially at 60%. And these are official numbers. So one can imagine what was the real number. Then you have a president, Abdelmadjid Tebboune, who multiplied the declaration of appeasement towards the Hirak, while in fact and in practice, he also set in motion the repressive machine with dozens of arrests of journalists, of activists, of ordinary citizens, of Hirakis. And finally, this new constitution is not a new move, actually. Every Algerian president who came to power tried to leave his print by putting forward a new constitution. But what is very important to keep in mind is the difference between what Bouteflika did and Abdelmadjid Tebboune did. When Bouteflika came to power in 1999, he was popular back then, and people voted for him. In addition, the increase in oil revenues back then led to a rise in living standards and the business class subordination to the president and his entourage. Today, this is really hard to reproduce because of difficult economic conditions. So Algerians are no longer, in fact, willing to accept a leadership model that produced not legitimacy, but support through dependency. And what is actually, in fact, if I may add 2 points, what is actually aggravating this legitimacy crisis beside the constitution and the economic situation that was exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis and its poor management, it's also the political class inability to implement the systemic and genuine political changes for which Algerians are calling. And finally, the departure of the president to Germany. Finally, the departure of the president to Germany and the total lack of transparency regarding his condition. I mean, Algerians had to learn from the Saudi that their president was sick. This is a total disdain for the people. So the people's idealization by the leadership in its public statement, in the constitution, as we have seen with the blessed Hirak, le Hirak béni, as the constitution stated, while actually showing disdain for popular demands in practice, that is unfortunately for the regime something that Algerians will not accept anymore.
Amal, critics of the government have said that one of the reasons that authorities in Algeria are reluctant to open up more political space there, or at least in a more definitive manner, is because they're afraid that they will be held accountable for their actions during the country's civil war. Do you think that's the case?
Well, of course, that's always the case, that the military has always been afraid to be held accountable, and that's why they direly need a president to be accountable for the governance. But again, I believe that the real crisis we are in Algeria, beyond the issue of constitution, is really linked to the possible absence of Tebboune for the next months. And if we remember what happened in April 2019, when Bouteflika was not Algeria's president anymore, what did we witness? We saw that Gaid Saleh, the then chief army and staff, actually filled the vacuum of this as the de facto head of the state. And now we are in the same situation, but we are having aggravating factors in terms of this crisis of governmentality and balance between civil and military powers. Algeria is hardly impacted by the COVID. Health and education and social and economic crisis that has been aggravated by the COVID and that Tebboune has not been able to manage well. The follow-up scenario, even if, as I said, a new puppet president is chosen to take the place of Abdelmadjid Tebboune, won't solve any question, because it will even complicate things much more. Because if you remember, when Abdelmadjid Tebboune came to power, he brought with him his own clientele, his own clans, and people who have been judged by Algerians as highly incompetent. So if a new president is chosen, he will also have to bring his own staff, and it will take time. And Algeria has not the luxury to lose more time. And there's also a problem of consensus between the top generals on the kind of successor they will choose. And there's also the main problem I see, especially in relationship with the Algerian people, and the fact that they have been largely boycotting the last presidential elections, today's referendum. How can you legitimize a new president through new presidential elections? That will be absolutely impossible to have.
Yasmine, we only have about 3 minutes left. I want to ask you about the opposition in Algeria, because many have said that the opposition there has been weakened by not having effective leadership. Has the opposition actually been able to articulate a vision for the country?
Well, yes, they have been very active with the Hirak demonstrators, by the simple reason that they rejected during the campaign. They were boycotting the people to go to the poll because simply for them, for example, whatever was in the constitution articles doesn't go in line with the aspiration of the people of the Hirak. And here I'm talking about the language, I'm talking about identity, the Algerian identity, etc. So I think that the real test for today, and it goes in line with what Dalia says, and I agree with her, the real test for this constitution will be the rate of voters. Today, we're talking about the opposition. How many will go to vote? Up until now, we read, for example, in the wilaya of Tizi Ouzou, you have like 63 communes that cancelled the vote because of security reasons. So one has to test the enthusiasm of the Algerian people, besides the opposition, and the readiness and conviction to go to the polls. And also during the campaign, there were some obstruction of this opposition, also the people from the Hirak to have their say. This is very important. That was not really, they were really shunned away. They were really imprisoned. So I think that let's remember also that during the presidential election, there was like a turnout of less than 40% of people who would go to the vote. So up until now, we have only 6% who went to the polls. So I think everything is clear. I think that the Algerian leadership needs to review its vision. The people are still the same. Because of that, the Algerians don't have there is not a good governance. I'm not talking about Algeria, but it's everywhere. But the Algerian has been infected for more than 100 years. We talk about civilian war. I don't think that there will be civilian war anymore, because the Algerian have suffered a lot because of the colonization for 100 years, the internal civil war. But all they need now is a good governance. All they need now is to find a good welfare for them. So I think that for that, yes, there will be people will vote. But I don't think it's going to be at the expectations of or at the aspiration of the Hirak people. Adding to that, there is call also for the
Yasmine, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks to all our guests, Yasmine Hasnaoui, Dalia Ghanem, and Amal Boubaker. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here. Bye for now.